Hey guys, my name is Wildcard and welcome back to my channel. So there has been some more talks about the New Zealand Rugby potentially selling 15% of its ownership to Silver Lake Investment from America. And there is basically a potential for a nuclear option where New Zealand Rugby will change the New Zealand Rugby players collective agreement and just kick the players out of the decision making process and get the deal done without the players' approval. Now, for this video, I want to look at why that New Zealand Rugby could potentially put this option and how the sporting team is being valued and how that compares to other sporting teams' valuation throughout the world. So first of all, the gist of this video is that New Zealand Rugby could potentially put the nuclear option because the valuation for New Zealand Rugby in comparison to other sporting teams around the world is ridiculous. It's multitudes higher than what other teams are getting paid from their investors. So let's have a look at the disagreement at the moment. So firstly, there is the breakdown from New Zealand Rugby basically listed the three potential outcomes for the deal. So they could either convince the players to agree to the deal, or they could potentially walk away with the players and not take the deal, or they could go for the nuclear option and redraft the collective agreement and basically kick players out from the decision-making process. Now, it is very, very hard for New Zealand Rugby to walk away from this deal. So number two, I can see that, as much as all of us rugby fans will, not wanted to sell All Blacks Rugby, the amount of money that's being offered is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it's I see it will be very, very hard for any team to walk away from that. Like, the value is basically the highest price to revenue ratio ever offered in sport. And it's by just an astronomical amount. So it's very hard. So it's looking going to be very likely that New Zealand Rugby is going to try their best to convince their players that this deal should be done. Otherwise, I think the nuclear option will be executed. They're not going to walk away from this deal. Now let's look at why this is such a ridiculous deal. So this document goes through the valuation process of a sporting team. So there's generally two parts to valuation. First part is the accounting valuation, which you will look at how much money the team makes and use that cash revenue to calculate a price for the sporting team. And the other price for the team is basically what's called the market value. It's basically how the market perceives the trend of the industry or the team and say how much value that it's worth whilst being traded on the market. So the Silver Lake firm will obviously be looking at the potential market value of the All Blacks and how that would affect its valuation in the future. So some of the things that changes the market value is the mood and momentum. That's basically they potentially could see that rugby is a very fast growing sport, which it is. There could be information that's coming out for rugby to be becoming more popular. For example, there could be potential for rugby breaking into China, and that would be a huge, huge slice of pie that will greatly improve the profitability of all rugby teams. And then based on this information, you could trigger something called the group think. Is basically everybody in the market thinks that rugby is going to be booming and offering higher valuations for all the teams in rugby. And that's what basically Silver Lake is looking at capitalizing with this deal. That's the market value of the team. But the book value of the team, if you do the numbers, is ridiculous. And that is why it's very hard for New Zealand Rugby to actually just say no to the deal. Because based on historical values, the pricing that's being offered is unprecedented. So let's have a look at some of the sporting. There's very few rugby teams like sales that we can find like compatible, and especially if we're looking at a valuation for the All Blacks at around 2.2 billion American dollars, which will put the All Blacks in the top 50 highest value teams in the world. We probably should look at other high value teams like football teams and NFL teams to get a sense of comparable pricing, right? So other teams that are in this sort of price range that's worth 2 billion plus, football teams and NFL teams and maybe one or two other teams, but mostly NFL teams and soccer teams. And the valuation for these teams, we can have this is a historical record here for NFL teams. The average, how the price is generally looked at is the revenue of the year of acquisition and how much money they pay for it. So the St. Louis Rams had a revenue of $228 million and they pay $750 million to sell. The acquisition was $750 million. So the revenue to acquisition price is 3.29. So the acquisition price is a little bit more than 3 times the revenue. So on the average transactions for NFL teams, it's 4.1 times. And the maximum is 5.78. So 5.8 times is the maximum revenue to acquisition price for an NFL team. Now, the other sports, the bit different. So NBA teams, NBA is also in the top 50. Again, 5 times, average is about 3. So average is a bit lower, but the top end is it's 5 times. Not as high as NFL teams, but it's pretty high up there too. And if we look at some other valuation for sport, Real Madrid's around at $4.2 billion. And their revenue for 2019 is 757 million euros. So that turns into about a bit more than maybe around 800 million, roughly. Maybe it's about 1.2. So maybe a bit more than that, actually, a bit more than that. So it's actually more than that, like more than $800 million in US dollars in revenue. So more than $800 million in US revenue. Let's just make it easy. Let's say $800 million US and its valuation is 4.24 billion. So that's more than 5 times the revenue for its valuation. So it's just a bit more than 5 times for Real Madrid, the top, one of the top football teams around the world, right? Now, let's have a look at the All Blacks. The All Blacks revenue is, in 2019, is $187 million. 2018, 189, so pretty similar. And the All Blacks valuation in New Zealand dollars, it's $3 billion. $3 billion, okay? And if you do the revenue to acquisition price, so if we do the maths, the actual ratio comes down to be 16 times. The price to revenue ratio is 16 times for the All Blacks. That is some very, very optimistic investors. And this is why New Zealand Rugby could pull the nuclear option. Because that is a ridiculous valuation. That's just so high. So high. So if another thing we can look at is New Zealand Rugby being valued around $2 billion, $2.2 billion. Other similar teams that are also valued around $2.2 billion because, as an investor, you could either invest in, Tampa Bay Buccaneers for $2.2 billion or the All Blacks for $2.2 billion. Buccaneers has, in 2019, $419 million US dollar revenue. That doesn't compare to 180 for. I mean, it's so far behind in terms of revenue, right? But so you must say, okay, why do they make so much money? Why do they offer such a high price? So there is one thing that New Zealand Rugby is different from other teams, and this is potentially why they made such a big offer, is because New Zealand Rugby has to pay a lot of has to pay for developmental costs that other sporting teams don't pay. Because the All Blacks is under the New Zealand Rugby is the same brand. So they pay for Mitre 10 Cups, they pay for Super Rugby teams, they pay for other small domestic teams for grassroots development. So if you look at the New Zealand Rugby developmental, we go back to the spreadsheet. New Zealand Rugby pay $33 million to game development, $92 million in competition cost, and on top of the salaries they pay for the All Blacks team members. So these money a normal sporting team wouldn't pay. Like no teams, like, you know, Manchester United do not pay for the Premier League to play the cost of running the Premier League, right? Or any of the lower leagues, they don't pay for that. But the All Blacks do. They pay for the lower leagues so they can get the players trickling up into the team. So that basically means that despite that the profit is negative for the All Blacks, if you take out the developmental cost, because the fact that no other international, like no other sporting teams, well, like non-national sporting teams, that is, pays for this cost, right? Then if you take that out, New Zealand Rugby is actually very, very profitable. The All Black team, I would say, not New Zealand Rugby, the All Black teams are actually very, very profitable. So if you take out the developmental cost, the All Black teams actually gets around $85 million New Zealand dollars of net income. So this is probably what Silver Lake is looking at. And if you look at, if you have net income of $85 million, since, you know, we're calculating everything in New Zealand dollars anyway, let's go back to a comparable valuation. You know, we have Real Madrid, $100 million at 4 billion US. So New Zealand Rugby is 80 million New Zealand at 3 billion New Zealand valuation, New Zealand dollar valuation. That is pretty, see, this is a good one. Bayern Munich, value at 3 billion US dollars, and they have 80 million earnings. So New Zealand Rugby has 85 million New Zealand dollars earnings, and the value at 3 billion New Zealand dollars. That is actually makes sense. That's an offer. That will make sense for them to make a $3 billion offer. An offer that's worth $3 billion. Because our comparables is looking at an $8 million revenue and $3 billion valuation. So, what is going to happen with New Zealand Rugby if they do make the sale, right? So one thing that Silver Lake would do is to ask New Zealand Rugby to be separated from the All Blacks. They will cut them out, and then they'll become two entities. So the All Blacks all these costs of like game development, competition will be off the books of the All Blacks. So the All Black books will instead of looking at minus $87 million cost, they will have a net income of $85 million. And they'll take the net income. Silver Lake will take 15% of that. And then another 15% will go to New Zealand Rugby. And New Zealand Rugby will take that and put that back into the game development and comp. So there will be there'll be a separation of New Zealand Rugby from the All Blacks brand. And then once that happens, this valuation will make sense. And then not to mention that there are a lot of potential, more advertising potential for the New Zealand Rugby jersey. Like you can definitely get logos on the jersey, sleeves. You can put up a competitive bid for the creator of the jerseys. Adidas has been with All Blacks for forever. They can definitely put that as a competitive bid with like Nike and potentially get more out of the rights to produce the jersey. They could potentially get a logo on the back, logo on the shorts. So that's going to increase the profitability as well. And then that profitability is split between New Zealand Rugby and Silver Lake, and then New Zealand Rugby will take the profit to pay for the grassroots, and Silver Lake, when that happens, All Blacks will go up in price, and hopefully they'll probably just sell it off to another company. They will exit. And yeah, when you look like that, it actually makes a lot of financial sense. And yeah, so it's difficult for decision for New Zealand Rugby to make. They are struggling, but getting an injection of cash for 15% is not going to stem the bleeding long term. You're going to make, you're just going to end up having the All Blacks team looking extremely profitable as a separate entity, and then the New Zealand Rugby themselves will still be bleeding out cash. So it really comes down to, like, ultimately how you can monetize the All Blacks team better. So if you're gonna, like, just basically having more advertising from the All Blacks team, you would pay for the cost. So yeah, that's basically the breakdown of how this deal is going to go ahead. So yeah, that is basically my analysis of what's going to happen. And I think the New Zealand Rugby would definitely looking at potentially selling the team. And ultimately, in my opinion, selling the team or don't sell the team, it doesn't really solve the problem that New Zealand Rugby is having, which is they're not actually monetizing the brand as much as the brand has potential for. But that is the problem. And I think selling the team is just gonna be like, it doesn't solve the problem. It just gives you money it gives you money that you're gonna slowly chew down. Eventually 10 years later, you're gonna run out of money again. 20 years later, you're gonna run out of money again. Unless there's fundamental changes in making the All Blacks more profitable. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble. Thank you for watching this video, guys. And if you like my videos, I do weekly reviews of the rugby games in Australia, the Super Rugby games in Australia, and some New Zealand games as well. I'll be doing international games recaps, and then I'll be doing more analysis on this sort of stuff in the future. So if you like it, please subscribe. And yes, I really appreciate you stopping by and checking out this video. Thanks, guys. I'll see you guys next time.